they refuse treatments. Yes. So unless they've been incapacitated by the court, they still have the right to refuse treatment, unless you're in an emergency situation and you have to give them a medication or restrain them somehow. Then you can do that if they're in danger. We kind of already talked about refusal to take medicine. While they're trying to, so they do have the right to refuse their medicine. You can certainly try to convince them why it's good, but you cannot move into coercing or threatening them to get them to take their medications. You have to depend on developing that therapeutic relationship with them and educating them. And then suspension of rights. I touched on this a little bit, and I know we see this, I think everybody goes to St. Anthony's at least part of the time. I could be wrong, but I think everybody has at least one location there. And I know that we have seen some of this there, basically where they might remove certain privileges from a client based on specific concerns. So one of the examples from St. Anthony's is they had a client once who, and I don't remember whether they were successful, but basically used their bra to hang themselves. And so they may not allow female clients to have bras for that reason, because they can be in danger. So just some things like that, and so those things, and he'll talk to you about this, those things don't always necessarily make sense to us from the outside, but they typically have been through something that led them to make that particular rule or regulation. And so this may be specific privileges, but once again, you'd be documenting what it was about that client that made you limit those privileges. Maybe that they can't, like I said, go to gym activities, or they can't, go walk outside or whatever, depending on what the privileges are. But those things do happen. But once again, we have to use that judiciously, or we get into the point where we've gone too far in limiting their freedoms. So you kind of have to always be evaluating, is this limit still necessary? Is it still the best thing for this client? Or could they have a little more freedom now? What's next? Those are nursing, once again, that's a nursing implication one, and we kind of already talked about that. Next thing, advanced directives. Advanced directives, very similar to what we know about medical advanced directives. Obviously, we're going to have to establish the initial mental competency of the individual at the time the document is created. So in order for them to sign a document, they have to be competent when they sign that document. And so that can sometimes, especially with people with mental illness, we have to be very sure that they knew what they were agreeing to at the point when they signed that document. It is something, there's a list on page 30 of your book, of your site book, that gives you specific items that can be addressed in those. If that's something that interests you, it's not necessarily something you're going to need to know for the test, but it'll kind of tell you what elements they can choose on that advanced directive on the mental health ones. And you need to be addressing that with each admission. If that document exists, then you need to have it and know what it says to treat your client. And you're also responsible for obtaining a consent from the proper individual, so you have to know who that person is in order to obtain consent from the proper person. So every admission, and that's true in the hospital admissions, when you guys start doing those admissions too, they're going to ask every single time, do you have an advanced directive? Do we have it on file? So not just, it's also psych, it's also important in mental health nursing, but also just at the hospital, you're going to ask those same questions. Okay, questions before we do our activity over legal stuff? Questions anyplace else? And I think you can probably get your activity done today. If I have this book here, and you can just look them up online, but basically, activity for today just deals with your standards that we talked about, the ANA professional standards for nurses. And you have crosswords and you have crossword hints. I'm trying to think, there are some that are 2 words, and so they don't have a space between them, but it tells you in the little hint if it's 2 separate words rather than 1 word. And it may not be the whole title of that standard, like some of them are more than 1 word, but the words are part of the standard, so you can holler it can't help. Because sometimes it seems simple when I'm putting them in the book, and when I look at them, I'm like, that's harder than I thought it was going to be. So I will pass these out. And you guys have those, right, Mr. Berg and Mrs. Martinez?
Yeah.